Pastor Mike, thank you so much for being with me today to talk about this very important topic that's a big part of confusion. I know for me, coming out of the New Age 3.5 years ago, I stumbled with reincarnation and the idea of karma. It was probably one of the last beliefs of the New Age that I let go of. And I know you've got quite a testimony that we'll share even more about toward the end of this video. But that was true for you too for a while, wasn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, the man who won me to the Lord was a student of Yogananda who became a Christian. And I told him before we prayed, I said, there's one belief I'll never give up. And he said, what is it? I said, it's reincarnation. I said, it seems logical to me. And he just looked at me with a big beaming smile full of love. And he said, just try Jesus and all of that will fall into place. And he was right.
So right. When I was in the New Age, I was a believer in the conspiracy theories that were perpetuated in the New Age. And I even tragically, and I repented for this, passed along the conspiracy theories that the Catholic Church and Constantine secretly removed all references to reincarnation from the Bible as a way of tricking and controlling us. And they left in a few verses that maybe they forgot about Elijah, the spirit of Elijah, and John the Baptist, and Jesus asking his disciples, who do they say I am? And the disciples saying, some say you are Elijah. And so can you help to reconcile that as a pastor who once did believe in reincarnation?
Well, it's amazing to me that you're starting off with that because I was going to ask you if we could start off with that.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what hooked me in.
Yeah, well, I had 300 students following my teachings when I was a teacher of Kundalini Yoga. And I would always reference what Jesus said about John the Baptist being Elijah as a verification of the idea of reincarnation. But if you follow it closely, if you follow the wording very closely, it becomes very clear that Jesus was not referring to that. The disciples asked Jesus, why is it written that Elijah must come first? And Jesus said that John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, which is a very important descriptive way of explaining it. It does not mean that he was a reincarnation of Elijah, but that rather he bore the same kind of calling and anointing and passion for truth. And the reason I can prove that is because Elisha, who was following Elijah, prayed that or pled with Elijah that if he could see him when he departed, that he would receive a double portion of his spirit. That did not mean that Elisha was Elijah reincarnated.
That's right.
Because they both lived at the same time. But it did mean that he had an anointing for the miraculous that even superseded what Elijah did. And when you look through what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, and I'm reading it now, he said concerning John the Baptist, he said, he is Elijah, which is to come. A metaphorical thing. It wasn't a literal thing because he functioned in a similar type of calling because Elijah turned the hearts of the people back to the truth when they were caught away in polytheism and a multiplicity of gods and worshiping with occult methods. And Elijah brought them back to the true and the living God. And John the Baptist did the same thing. And so he came in that same kind of mindset. But I teach that definitely Jesus did not teach reincarnation because it would have been a contradiction of everything else he taught.
Absolutely. He would not have needed to go to the cross if we could come back again and again.
Right, absolutely.
And he said, it's finished. That's it. So, yes. and also the transfiguration, right?
Right, because in the transfiguration, Elijah appeared and Moses appeared standing on either side of Jesus in this wonderful visionary experience that Peter, James, and John had. If John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah, they would have been very confused by the appearance of Elijah. There, they would not know if that was Elijah or if that was John the Baptist, and they would not have identified him so readily as Elijah. they would have referred to John the Baptist. So that's a good proof as well.
Indeed. To hit the high points of why I believed in reincarnation, why I stopped, I had past life regressions. I used to do past life regressions and teach classes on it. I wrote about it. I had an audio on a past life regression, and I've repented for that, and I apologize if anyone was in any way led away from Jesus by my previous work. And I know some of it's for sale out there right now, and I've asked that it not be for sale. I'm not selling it. It's just that now what I hear is they're getting rid of the old stock. They're selling out the bottom of the warehouse stock, and hopefully soon it'll be gone. But my point is I had a lot of past life regressions, including with a very famous past life regressionist named Dolores Cannon. And what tripped me up after Jesus saved me and I was a Christian was that some of the past life memories that I had were in history, and they were things that I'd never learned before, and that I was able to corroborate historically, one to Babylon and one to ancient Russia. And I had not studied either one of those cultures at the time. But could I talk with you about this? Because I really believe that was demonic intervention. I think that was like a Screw Tape Letters, C.S. Lewis moment where it was being planted in my head. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, I agree with you 100% that demons do not go through birth and death as human beings do. They have an infinite existence. And so, or at least they have a starting point. They were created as angels and then fell. And then from that point forward, will not die or cease to exist. But they existed in those locations and experienced those experiences and glean that knowledge by influencing people who lived at that time, possibly even possessing or at least oppressing certain individuals where they could gather that information. Well, those individuals passed away, but the demons didn't. Mm-hmm. And then they can come to someone, especially who's opened the portal, who's opened the door through New Age practices, through meditation, through yoga, through various occultic means, and they can bring that knowledge to you and even deceive you to the point of thinking it's coming directly from a previous incarnation. But it's false knowledge, it's false information that is supposed to unravel the biblical point of view. That's the purpose of it, because reincarnation does away with the importance of the individual. Individual lives are discardable on this evolutionary journey, this reincarnation journey toward perfection. And it's taught, of course, that if you have a bad life, then you're suffering for previous karma. And once it's over, you'll be born in hopefully a better set of circumstances. But that old personality, that old individual is discarded on this evolutionary journey. And so that's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants the individual to lose value in the sight of God, where in Christianity, each individual has infinite value because that individual will live on eternally in one destination or the other. And so it's vitally important to come to grips with whether or not reincarnation is true or resurrection. And there's another point right there, Doreen, that Jesus did not teach reincarnation. He taught resurrection. He said very clearly, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes on me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And so he taught that there would actually be a physical change in our mortal bodies where we would put on immortality, as Paul put it, and this corruptible must put on incorruption. And I used to think that was just so illogical. What if somebody is buried at sea and the fish of the sea devour the body, and then the crabs devour the fish, and then the bacteria devour the crabs, and the remains of that person is scattered all over the ocean? How could God ever resurrect that individual if that person was a believing Christian and change that person in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, as the Bible teaches? And what I teach when I deal with this subject is that God doesn't have to have the entire substance of the physical body to create the new glorified body that he has promised to give his believers. Just like he started off with a handful of dust to create Adam. And why did God have to do that? He had spoken the universe into existence. Let there be light, let there be a firmament, let the dry land appear. Everything happened with lightning speed. Why did he stop and slow down that chain of events and pick up a handful of dust and form the first man? Because he chose to, because that's the way he wanted to do it. And there's a beauty in it. It shows personal care in the making of that man that would bear his image. Well, why does God choose resurrection? The Baha'i faith, for instance, doesn't believe in reincarnation or resurrection. They just say we evolve to higher levels as we progress eternally. But I believe God chose resurrection as the path to future purpose, what he has for us. And he doesn't have to have the entire physical body. If he just has even microscopic remains, well, is he confined to that? Couldn't he just speak a glorified body into existence? Yes, he could. But he chooses to use some of the corruptible parts of our former body, even if it's gone back to dust, in order, I think, to prove his power over that, prove his power over the corruptible, instead of just starting out with something brand new by the spoken word.
To glorify God. It's all about glorifying God.
Yes, it is.
So related to reincarnation, of course, the belief is that you have a lot of chances to get it right, where Christianity says one life, a man is to live once and then die, as it says in Hebrews, and you better surrender to God. You better have your relationship right with God, because your next life is eternity. Whereas reincarnation says, oh, you've got lots of chances, like that old movie Groundhog Day, to get it right. And so you don't really worry about sinning when you're believing in reincarnation. Is that the enemy's plan, Pastor Mike?
Well, most people, of course, that believe in reincarnation don't believe in sin either.
That's true.
They're just mistakes or errors. And usually it doesn't include some self-gratifying lusts that people indulge in that they think are not harmful to other people. They kind of gloss that over, where there's moral parameters in the Bible that we've got to live within in order to be right with God. And yes, that does kind of dull people's desire to live a very committed and consecrated life, because they think it's all stretched out. In the Hindu faith, they say you're reincarnated over 1 million times.
Oh, wow.
Think of that, over 1 million times, from mineral state to vegetable to animal to human. And many Hindu people believe you can shuttle back and forth between the human state and the animal state. And maybe we can get to that a little bit later on.
Yeah, I mean, these fantasies are always lovely. If that was true, I'd love to be a Persian cat someday. But it's just, it's not true. It's not the fact. And it's very dangerous to believe that because you're dealing with your eternal soul, where you're going to stay. And there's only 2 places that we can go to after this life. And this life is so short. And we're filming this in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic on March 26, 2020. So there's a lot of thoughts going on about our life, our death, people dying all around us. And now's the time to really surrender our life to Jesus and to commit to Jesus and be saved.
Absolutely.
So that we can go to heaven.
And there's plenty of arguments against the idea of reincarnation that are very logical. I originally embraced it as a yoga teacher 50 years ago because I thought it preserved the integrity of God. I thought it preserved the concept of the justice of God, because God seemed very unjust if one person was born crippled and demented and another person was born with a perfect physical body and a sharp mind, or maybe someone was born in very abject poverty conditions and another person born into wealth. That just didn't seem fair to me. And reincarnation put it all in a different perspective, where over a period of thousands of lives, then it evens out. But when I really inspected it closely, I believe the idea of reincarnation increases injustice, especially in Buddhism. In Buddhism, it's taught that you have no soul. No soul passes from one incarnation to the next, just something they call an unconscious disposition. It's like a spark of existence. And the person that you were in the previous incarnation has no connection to the person you are in this incarnation and their teaching. But you do suffer all the negative karma for that other person's actions. Well, that's injustice to the highest degree. If I have no recall of the things I did wrong for which I'm now suffering, but I'm suffering because of something someone else did that was bad, then that's very unjust to me.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at it that way, the innocent child that has cancer is no longer innocent. And the starving person, emaciated, laying on the street in India, is no longer an innocent victim of a culture that ignores his plight, or of a city that is so steeped in poverty they can't deal with his plight. It becomes a blamable thing. He's suffering for something he deserves to suffer for, so why even intervene?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's another problem. If I, as a doctor or a humanitarian, were to intervene in the life of the starving person or the sick person to try and rectify what's wrong, then I am, in a sense, disrupting their karmic payoff, and I may even delay it where they have to suffer again in a future life. So the better approach is exactly what Hinduism teaches, is detachment. Just detach myself from all of this suffering and go inward and find my higher self, and not really deal with the pain that's around me. And so there's some things that we should consider when thinking about this concept of reincarnation that I believe show its fallacy.
You know, that's such a good point, Pastor Mike. When I was in the New Age, myself and a lot of my friends, we treated spirituality like a buffet, where we take a little bit from Hinduism, a little bit from Buddhism, a little bit from Native American spirituality, and this and that and this, and we kind of make our own plate of all these different tidbits. But when you do what you just talked about, when you really go deep and examine the complete theology of these different cultures, most New Agers would probably say, well, I don't really believe in that. And you can't pick and choose, can you?
Well, I believe that truth is objective. It's not subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And when I preach in India, that's something I always bring up.
Oh, what is the response when you talk about reincarnation not being true in India? Because isn't that kind of a foundational belief there?
Well, it is. But the first thing I establish in most of my messages when I teach in India is the idea that truth is identifiable and it is objective. It's the same for every human being, whether we acknowledge it or not.
Mm-hmm. And
the analogy I usually bring out, which seems to be very effective, is comparing the beliefs of Ptolemy in the 2nd century with Copernicus 1,000 years later. How Ptolemy believed the Earth was the center of the solar system, and the Earth and the sun revolved around the Earth. And Copernicus, on the contrary, said, no, the sun's at the center and the Earth revolves around the sun. They can't both be right.
Right.
One idea is right at the expense of the other idea being wrong. And truth is like that. If that's true scientifically, and our generation prides itself in scientific advancement, and yet science always promotes the idea of observation, experimentation, observation, and then if something doesn't fulfill the criteria, you throw it out. It's not true. But as you said, in the New Age, we just accept everything.
Yeah.
If we have to be New Agers, we just accept anything and everything as being valid and true, even if there's contradictions in the beliefs.
Yeah, you don't think about contradictions because that would be, quote, negative. And I think the only rule in the New Age is to stay positive at all times, you know.
Yeah, and yet there is an objective truth. There is, and there's a way of seeing it that is God's way of seeing it, and we have to go with his way and not invent our own,
Yeah.
because too often people just invent their own spirituality, invent their own idea about God. But one thing that used to bother me, even when I believed in reincarnation, is how did suffering and evil appear in the life of a person to begin with if they're born with a clean slate? If they're born pure and untainted with no negative karma, how come bad stuff happens?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's not a person in this world that does not have evil, imperfection, or suffering in his or her life. Well, how could that even be possible if we're born with perfection in every area? So that's one argument against it. And also, I believe it's important to see the impossibility of the idea of a karmic payoff. And just to give you a scenario, possible scenario, what if someone during his lifetime was a thief and he stole from 1,000 people? Let's take a good round number, like 1,000. So in the next life, he has to have robberies take place where he is robbed 1,000 times to pay off for the 1,000 times he robbed. Well, I have a question. First of all, how in the world would you orchestrate 1,000 robberies? Would the people forced into that karmic payoff be controlled by karma so that they have to rob him
Mm-hmm.
in order for his karmic debt to be paid off, and yet they reap karmic debt themselves in the same process?
Yeah.
Or did somehow this amazing web of karmic payoff find people that were already minded toward robbing and guide them toward him? But is that ever a resolvable situation?
Yeah,
Because
that's
then
really good.
those 1,000 robbers have to all be robbed, and the robbers of the robbers have to be robbed, and the
So
robbers of the robbers of the
exponentially,
robbers.
it'd be 1,000,000 people being robbed all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah, it grows
Mm-hmm.
in number and will never be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
So how could it ever have a final conclusive end?
I think that's a really good argument. I want to just share what finally got me off of reincarnation, because I did a lot of research, and a lot of what you're pointing out I didn't even get to. But what really got me, Pastor Mike, was I decided it's too harsh here on earth, and why in the world would I ever want to come back?
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to heaven with Jesus for eternity, and I pray that I feel like I'm saved. I've got the fruit of salvation, like the Bible says. But gosh, to come back here to earth versus going to heaven, I mean, there's no choice. To me, it's heaven or bust, and so that's what really, when I finally realized, why would I want to come back here again? That's when, boom, I just let go of reincarnation.
And let me ask you a question, and I think I know what you'll answer, but I want to set the stage. Do you think a plant like a lily becoming a rock, a lifeless, inanimate rock, would be progress?
No.
Is that progression or digression?
Well, I mean, it depends how you feel about lilies and rocks. Personally, I prefer flowers.
Yeah, they're living.
Mm-hmm.
They
They're
have
pretty.
beauty.
Yeah.
Yeah, instead of just a rock,
Mm-hmm.
who gets.
No offense to those of you who like rocks.
Yeah, no offense at all. I collected them when I was a kid.
Yes,
too.
I had a big collection.
But the logical train of thought I'm trying to get to is that in the theory of reincarnation, and it is a theory, you go through numerous lifetimes, rather. You go through numerous lifetimes as a living, breathing, thinking, feeling, functional human being on your way to oneness with Brahman. And Brahman is an impersonal cosmic force, a level of consciousness, if you will. And I contend with reincarnationists, that's not progress. To go from being a personal being to merging with an impersonal being so that you become omnipresent, omniscient, etc., and you blend in with this cosmic force that is universal in scope, that's not progress. To lose the trappings of a personal nature, that's digression. And I don't believe it's the path God's chosen for human beings at all, because we're a notch above the impersonal by having a quote unquote personality. And when Jesus taught his disciples, he told them that one day, and he was describing the marriage supper of the Lamb, that one day they would sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Now, if reincarnation was true, we wouldn't recognize Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because who have they been incarnated since?
Right, exactly.
And wouldn't those personalities be discardable and no longer relevant or important? So Jesus definitely wouldn't have made a statement like that unless those individual personalities would live on forever.